Welcome back, everybody. Today is the third video in our four-part series or unit on American Catholic history. We've been reading two books, the Maura Jane Farley book that explores anti-Catholicism from the beginning to the mid until just before the Civil War, and then the book that we're starting to explore this week and getting to next week is Russell Shaw's book, The American Church: The Remarkable Rise, Meteoric Fall, and Uncertain Future of Catholicism in America. You'll remember that without trying to overly reduce this or be overly simplistic, there are sort of three eras or themes to this question. The first is what Farley talked about, anti-Catholicism in America. The second is what we're going to be talking about today, and that is with the mass migration in the second half of the 19th century, the question that these immigrants had to face was, do we want to become fully American? And that means things like believing in representative governments, which of course coming from Italy and other places during that time period, representative governments were not really dominant. And then also things like, we've been talking about the idea of freedom, that the Protestant definition of freedom certainly becomes the secular definition of freedom even till this day in this country, right? This idea of the ability to do whatever you want, as opposed to the Catholic definition that we saw in the past couple of weeks of true freedom is liberation from the radical slavery of sin so that I can choose the good. So that's the question that we're going to be really wrestling with today. And then we'll finish the book in the unit, the Shaw book, and then our unit next week with the third theme or wave of American Catholic history that answers the question. We see a sort of definitive yes, that the immigrants and their families, their descendants, answer the question, yes, we want to be fully American. And then Shaw will ask the question, at what cost? Is this really something that we should have done? Here are the fruits of that commitment. How has that left the church today? All right, and when we'll be talking in class about these, as we wrestle with these questions, and what can we do? Do we agree with Shaw's arguments? And what do we do about it if we do? What do we do about it if we don't? So that's the arc of this unit. Today we're again starting with that second of the three periods. And overall, this sort of question has to do, again, with enculturation. Do we want to become fully enculturated with the dominant American culture? Now, I want to state that this is not something uniquely American or uniquely to this particular time period, that this question is something that Christians have wrestled with since the beginning. In fact, goes back before the beginning of Christianity to Judaism. And so what I want to do here at the beginning is first talk about a few classic examples, classic answers to this question about how much should Christians engage with the dominant culture, whether that's the American culture in our current situation, or as we're about to see, the Egyptian culture. Right. So going back to the Old Testament. So this is a very, very old question that Christians continue to struggle with. So let's go back to the Old Testament. So a story that you all know, the story told in Exodus. The Israelites, of course, had gone to Egypt, and over the centuries end up becoming enslaved. And then we know the story of the burning bush telling Moses to go and liberate God's people. So what happens, of course, now we're starting here in Exodus 3, verse 22. So this is just before the plagues are unleashed because Pharaoh won't allow the Israelites to go, at least not initially, we know. So at this point in chapter 3, God's talking to Moses, and he tells Moses, sort of when this happens, when you Israelites eventually get liberated, here's what I want you to do, right? So notice this is God's commanding of the Israelites, and he says, "But every woman shall ask her neighbor and the woman who lives in her house for articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And you will put them on your sons and daughters, so you will plunder the Egyptians, right? Now, what is this getting at here? This is getting at the idea that, okay, yes, the Israelites have been living among the Egyptians, and not 100% of everything that the Egyptians have should be rejected. So you can, not only can, but again, God is commanding this, you should take their articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing, right? So when you Israelites flee, take this stuff with you, right? Plunder the Egyptians. So notice that it is acceptable and in fact commanded by God to take sort of the material possessions of the Egyptians. They don't have to reject those possessions outright simply because they belong to a different culture. Notice, of course, that the one of the things that they're told to take is the gold of the Egyptians. Now, we know where this story goes, of course, that when the Israelites are wandering in the desert, what do? When Moses is up on the mountain communing with God, they turn to Aaron and say, we don't know what happened to this Moses guy, and the God that he's following. So why don't you make a God for us? And then Aaron collects the gold of the Israelites, which had originally been the gold of the Egyptians, casts it into, melts it down, and then you have the molten calf. So the story here is again the idea of taking, yes, the material possessions, that's fine, engaging with that sort of thing, but the problem then becomes idolatry, of taking on the gods of either the Egyptians or any of the other nations surrounding the Israelites, right? So that's, of course, the first of the Ten Commandments, right? You shall have no God before me. So you can take some things, gold, silver, etc., clothing, but hold off other things, the gods of other nations. So again, that's what in chapter 3 God is telling that the Israelites they will do after they are liberated. So let's now jump ahead to Exodus chapter 12. This is verse 35 and 36. We see that sort of command of God come true. So now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Therefore, they plundered the Egyptians. All right. So God says what's going to happen, and not surprisingly, it happens. So this is not just sort of me personally plucking out of the Bible some passages that I think are interesting, but this, especially in the early church with people like St. Augustine and St. Jerome, they turn to this passage or this story here and use this as an example of how the Israelites should relate to other nations. Another story, just quickly from the Old Testament, there's the question later on, when the Israelites would conquer another nation and take their women, the question is, well, what do you do with their women? Do you have to enslave them? Can you marry them? Do you have to just kill them because they're not Israelites? What do you do? And the answer in the Bible is, yes, you can take them into your household, but you first have to cut their hair and trim their fingernails, right? So that's another story of like, okay, we can engage and take into our homes other people outside of our group, but we can't just take them wholesale, if you will, or take them as they are. We have to trim their fingernails, cut their hair. So this idea of shearing off anything that's not good or in harmony with the Israelite way of life. Now, in the early church wrestled with this question of inculturation, specifically the sort of, at that time, the larger Roman culture, right? Think of, for example, Augustine's City of God, right? I think we've talked about this in class before, the idea that in the early 5th century, Rome was sacked in the year 410, and a lot of the pagans were criticizing Christians because the emperors had been Christian for a few decades by this point, and their claim was, well, Rome is sacked and burning because we've turned away from the gods. So the question again is, how should Christians relate to the Roman culture, right? So this is something that was important not only for Americans in the 19th and 20th century and 21st century, but from the early church. So I want to give you just a couple of sort of classic quotations here. This first one comes from Tertullian. He was sort of the last years of the 2nd century and the first decades of the 3rd century, so early church, prior to Augustine, prior to Jerome. He was from North Africa. He was one of the most important Latin or Western writers in the early church. He, for example, coined the term Trinitas, Trinity, right? When we talk about God as a Trinity or Trinitarian, that term, of course, is not a biblical term, although the idea is in the Bible, but it is a term that comes from this guy Tertullian. So he's a very important North African theologian and influential for the West. And he, as we're about to see, really wanted to have nothing to do with sort of the dominant culture. Right? At that time, it was the Roman culture, and there are other Christians that are more suspicious of the dominant culture, whatever that dominant culture might be. So think of, even today, you have groups like the Amish or the Mennonites, or groups like that. If you've ever been to the Pennsylvania Dutch country, the term you may have heard is the English. The English is a term that they use for everybody who's not Amish. Right. So just as the Jews and Israelites use the term Gentile to describe every nation that's not Jewish, the English has nothing to do with England or speaking the language of English. It's just that group of everybody that's not of us, of the Amish. And so, and as you know, they don't do things like participate in the military. They don't run for public office. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't use insurance, sort of secular insurance companies. They do all kinds of different things. They have their own school systems and sort of reject anything of the larger dominant American culture. And so you can see here in this quotation I'm about to read from Tertullian a sort of classic answer to that. I don't think the Amish really turn to Tertullian as a figure for them, but it's the same sort of spirit. So this comes from a text called Prescription Against Heretics. It was written again around the turn of the 3rd century. So Tertullian says, "From all these, when the apostle Paul would restrain us, he expressly names philosophy as that which he would have us be on guard against. Writing to the Colossians, he says, 'See that no one beguile you through philosophy and vain deceit after tradition of men and contrary to the wisdom of the Holy Ghost.' He had been at Athens and had in his interviews with its philosophers become acquainted with that human wisdom which pretends to know the truth, while it only corrupts it and is itself divided into its own manifold heresies by a variety of its mutually repugnant sects. What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? Our instruction comes from the porch of Solomon, who had himself taught that the Lord should be sought in simplicity of heart. Away with all attempts to produce a modeled Christianity of Stoic, Platonic, and dialectic composition. We want no curious disputation after possessing Christ Jesus, no inquisition after enjoying the gospel. With our faith we desire no further belief, for this is our palmary faith, and there is nothing which we ought to believe besides. In the middle of that quotation there is sort of his classic phrase, what indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Athens here, of course, standing in as the place of Greek philosophy. Think of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, etc. And Jerusalem, of course, the place of the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension, the place of sort of standing in for Christianity. So in other words, what does Greek philosophy have to do with Christian teachings, Christian truths? And his answer is absolutely nothing. Notice, of course, he does also, he's referencing and quoting St. Paul, right, the letter to the Colossians. And so we see Paul and Tertullian saying no to sort of this idea of the philosophical traditions of man using human reason, and Tertullian is putting that in opposition to divine revelation. So his answer is a big no to philosophy, and he would expand that in many ways towards this idea of the dominant Roman culture at that time. So we see another biblical reference here. And Tertullian's vision has, again, continued on until this day, certainly in certain Catholic circles, but also in groups like the Amish that I just mentioned. Sort of the opposite answer to this question comes from Basil of Caesarea. St. Basil, he was one of the Cappadocian fathers. Cappadocia is in what we now call Turkey, along with Gregory of Nazianzus and St. Gregory of Nyssa. Those three are the Cappadocian fathers from the 4th century, some of the most important theologians in the history of the church. And he has this wonderful text called the Address to Young Men on Greek Literature. Now, what he means by Greek literature there, again, is yes, language written in the literature written in the Greek language, but what he's really talking about there is sort of non-Christian, pagan literature, and he talks about not just literature in the sense of like Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad, but he's talking about philosophy, right? He talks about philosophy. He talks about history. Should you read pagan histories? Should you read those Greek philosophers? The same question that Tertullian was asking just about 150 years earlier. So here's a quotation from Basil, his Address to Young Men on Greek Literature. Do not be surprised if to you who go to school every day and who through their writings associate with the learned men of old. I say that of my own experience. I have evolved something more useful. Now this is my counsel, that you should not unqualifiedly give over your minds to these men, right? So double negative there. As a ship is surrendered to the rudder to follow whither they list, but that, while receiving whatever of value they have to offer, you yet recognize what is wise to ignore. Accordingly, from this point on, I shall take up and discuss the pagan writings and how we are to discriminate among them. So what is Basil saying here? He's saying, getting back to that image we see with the Egyptians and the Israelites, take on whatever is good from them, but hold off whatever is not good from them, right? Receiving whatever of value they have to offer. So take what is good, take that, quote unquote, gold, silver clothing, but in this case, meaning philosophy, literature, history, yet recognize what is wise to ignore. That there's going to be, especially in think of like philosophy or literature, that there's sort of moral things that are repugnant to a Christian mind. So hold off on those, ignore those. And then the text goes on, he goes in a bit more detail and talking about those categories of philosophy and history and literature. So you have here with Tertullian and Basil sort of two classic answers to this question about how should Christians engage with the dominant culture. And this is something that continues until today. Think, for example, of the question of the Harry Potter book series, right? A lot of Christians fought over this and continue to fight over this, and these books are sometimes pop up as sort of getting banned from school libraries. On the one hand, there is witchcraft in these books, so a lot of Christian parents will say, well, I don't want my children reading anything about witchcraft. On the other hand, there are clearly Christian themes. I actually remember when I was in grad school talking to my best friend. He was really into the Harry Potter books, and I was not. And I think it was right before the last book came out. And I said to him, I don't know how Rowling's going to sort of end this series, but I bet it's going to have a real Christological key to it. And of course, I mean, it couldn't be more Christological, right? He dies and comes back to life and does so, dies out of a gesture of love, sacrificial love. Like, what could be more Christian than that? So you clearly have Christian themes throughout the text. So what do parents do? Especially when you're dealing with young kids who don't have the ability to discern in their minds what's Christian, what's, in harmony with Christian views, what is not in harmony. Should we take, how do we deal with this question of witchcraft, for example? So this question continues on till today. So let's get back to American history, and let's see, how does this specific question of how should Catholics engage with the dominant American culture, late 19th, early 20th centuries, how did that manifest itself, right? So we're going to read through a couple of sections here and see the concentrated parts of this question. So the first one, we're simply going to turn to page 1 of the text, of the Shaw text. This is a quotation here from James Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore, right? He's one of the, well, you can describe him whether you want to call him a protagonist or antagonist. That's up to you. But for Shaw, certainly sort of the distilled version of Americanism, right? That this sort of a pro-America. America is great for Catholicism, especially in comparison with the cultures and states, governments, legal structures of the old world, of the European countries, right? So he thinks this is American culture is great for Catholicism. Let's see what he has to say here. Thanks to the fructifying grace of God, the grain of mustard seed has grown to be a large tree, spreading its branches over the length and breadth of our fair land. Where only one bishop was found in the beginning of this century, who is that? We talked about him, John Carroll. There are now 75 serving as many dioceses and vicariates. For their great progress under God and the fostering care of the Holy See, we are indebted in no small degree to the civil liberty we enjoy in our enlightened republic. I proclaim with a deep sense of pride and gratitude that I belong to a country where the civil government holds over us the aegis of its protection without interfering in the legitimate exercise of our sublime mission as ministers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, Gibbon here saying that the flourishing of Catholicism in the 19th century, going from one bishop to 75 bishops in that time, and this is 1887, is not just sort of made possible, but encouraged in a sense by civil liberty, right? This idea that we've talked about, so I don't want to repeat it, but that there are no, there's not state-sponsored religion as you have even till this day in places like England or Germany. And that the fact that there's no state-sponsored religion and that we, as well as every other religion, has civil liberty, that this is a good thing and it allows us to grow, right? So here is a praise of the government. Elsewhere in this text, Gibbons will also talk about sort of American culture a little bit more. We don't have time to get into that. But here, a sort of very pro-American vision. But there's the other side, right? As I mentioned, already that at this point in American history, there's still a debate. These immigrants coming over, do we want to become fully American or not? And so here's one argument, but we're now going to move, this is on page 32, to another argument, a man that we've seen before, that we saw last time, Orestes Bronson. So I don't want to review who he was. But Bronson is not as excited about American culture for the Catholic Church as Gibbons was. And in fact, you'll remember we ended the video last time where Bronson says that the only way that American democracy is going to flourish is because of the Catholic Church, because of the inculcation of virtues. We talked about virtues last time. So Bronson says, well, if this thing is going to work, this American project, it's going to be because of the Catholic Church. And he's not too thrilled with it to begin with anyways. So here's what Bronson says, page 32. Instead of regarding the church as having advantages here, which she has nowhere else, think back to that Gibbons claim, I think she has a more subtle and more powerful enemy to combat than in any of the old monarchical nations of the world. So what's he saying? Yeah, sure, we've got religious liberty, and so these sort of monarchies that are imposing a particular view, yeah, that's a problem, especially in places like England that at the time was virulently anti-Catholic. But there's this American civil liberty is even more problematic because it's more subtle. And what is the subtlety? Well, let's keep reading. Say what we will, we have made little impression on our old American population, and what little we have made we owe to the conviction that the church sustains authority, demands government, is anti-radical, anti-democratic, right? So whatever gains that we have made as Catholics in the United States is based on the fact that we stand opposed to what many in the United States stand for. Catholics, as well as others, imbibe the spirit of the country. We drink in the spirit of the country. Imbibe from infancy the spirit of independence, freedom from all restraint, unbounded license. So far we are from converting the country, we cannot hold our own. So far are we from converting the country, we cannot hold our own. How many Catholics can you find born and brought up in the country that do in reality hold the church to be higher than the people, or who do not consider her voice authoritative only when it coincides with that of the people, right? Think of the people as that sort of representative government that we talked about. So here he's saying, in a sense, that the people, the American people, in the minds of certainly non-Catholic Americans, but to his mind, to his chagrin, in the minds of Catholics as well, that the people are above the church, right? That's an inversion or perversion of what the order should be, according to Bronson. These considerations make me feel that the whole influence of democratic ideas and tendencies is directly antagonistic to Catholicity. I think the church has never encountered a social political order so hostile to her, and that the conversion of our republic will be a far greater victory than the conversion of the Roman Empire. I have hitherto wished to effect a harmony of the American and Catholic idea, but I believe such harmony impracticable except by sacrificing the Catholic idea to the national. So in a sense, Bronson is agreeing with those Protestants that we've talked about in the Farley book. Remember that the American Protestants were suspicious of American Catholics because they said they had divided loyalties and they couldn't be fully American. And Bronson here is saying, yes, that's true, and that's the way it should be. That's a good thing. American Catholics should not fully embrace this American culture. And if we do, it is to our own detriment. So, Gibbons, Bronson, two different ways of thinking about America. Gibbons says that American civil liberty allows us to do and to be who we are. Bronson saying those liberties dilute or water down our Catholic identity such that we become no different from our Protestant brothers and sisters in this country. So these two quotations are good summaries of that fight that was happening during that period. We saw in the Farley book that European Catholics looked suspiciously on American Catholics, and here we see that a sort of term arose around the turn of the century, last century, Americanism, sort of an umbrella term that summarizes what European Catholics, specifically the Pope, had problems with American Catholics and the way that sort of Catholicism manifested itself here as influenced by American Protestantism. So now we're jumping ahead. This is on page 46 and then 47. So bottom of page 46. So what is Americanism? Well, we don't have time to get into every little detail. This section will just give us a few. But you'll remember from reading this text that because it's not talking about specific people or specific doctrines, as we'll see here, it's more about an attitude or an approach, that one of the responses to this Americanism, the criticism of Americanism, is that, everything that you're listing here, well, we Catholics in America, we don't believe this anyway. So sure, this doesn't apply here, right? This was the Catholic response to the Pope when Americanism was condemned. So, bottom of 46, what is this Americanism? One set of ideas condemned by Leo XIII. You'll remember we talked about Leo XIII already, and we'll probably continue to come back and talk about him. He was the Pope after Pius IX, wrote Rerum Novarum, and we saw in the Farley book a quotation from him that summarizes the Catholic definition of freedom. So you remember we've encountered Leo before. One set of ideas condemned by Leo XIII concerns placing natural virtues above supernatural ones, along with a division of virtues into passive and active that assigns preference to the latter as supposedly more suited to modern times. This is said to lead to a certain contempt for the religious life and to the disparagement of religious vows. Let me pause there. So, passive and active virtues, what's he getting at here? Another way of describing this that you may have heard of it called the active life and the contemplative life, right? So the active life, lay people living in the world, raising families, and then the contemplative life usually summarized by monasticism, right? So for example, the classic biblical story is Mary and Martha. Martha, of course, complains to Jesus that Mary is letting Martha do all the sort of hosting of the guests, right, running around and doing what hosts do. And Mary is just kind of sitting there listening. And Jesus says, critiques Martha for her complaint and said, Mary's made the right decision. Well, at least as far back as the 5th century, with a man named John Cassian, I think we've talked a little bit about him before. He was one of the great monastic writers of the early church. He and others interpret that Mary and Martha story to say that Jesus is pointing to the contemplative life of monasticism, of consecrated virginity, as superior to the active life, right? The life of living in the world. And what here Leo XIII is concerned with is that the modern mind, the modern world, is flipping that on its head and saying that the active life is better than the contemplative life, or what here is called a passive life, right? So again, that last part I read, this is said to lead to a certain contempt for the religious life. Religious meaning, the Benedictines that we've talked about, for example, or the Ursulines that we've talked about, those men and women who lived in religious communities. So for Leo, that's dangerous because it's flipping or inverting what Catholicism has held since the story of Mary and Martha. If that were all that was to Americanism, as is described in Testem Benevolentiae, It might be taken as a Victorian precursor to the crisis afflicting religious life in the United States during the years since Vatican II, a serious matter that is yet comparably limited in scope, right? So after Vatican II, we do in fact see this, a lot of priests and religious men and women leaving their orders, leaving their priesthood, in order to engage and be again active, to live the active life. And so you see a sort of dismissal or a denigration of the religious life. That, however, was by no means all that troubled Pope Leo. His concerns focused especially on the basis of new opinions converging in Americanism, saying it arose from a desire to attract to the Catholic Church those who dissent. Leo summed it up in these words: the Church should come closer to the civilization of this advanced age, and relaxing its old severity, show indulgence to those opinions and theories of the people which have recently been introduced. Lest anyone be uncertain about what that meant, the Pope added that many believe that the relaxation should even extend to the doctrines in which the deposit of faith is contained. But already he insisted the magisterium of the Church was as flexible as fidelity to divine revelation would allow. Furthermore, the norm of flexibility was not to be determined by the decision of private individuals. It should be the judgment of the Church. Opposed to this orthodox understanding and prominent among the errors of the day was the view that the faithful may indulge, each one his own mind. Think back to Thomas Paine. Inasmuch as nowadays the Holy Spirit was bestowing more and richer gifts than in past times, a largesse empowering everyone to settle matters on belief for himself by a kind of hidden instinct. All right, so what else is Leo concerned with here? Not only the active life or the contemplative life, but that the Church should, quote, come closer to the civilization of this advanced age, right? This is grounded in something that we've talked about before in a previous video lecture, that Enlightenment modern way of thinking of progress towards a perfected humanity, that we're always moving forward, we're always getting better, rejection of the idea of original sin. And so what the result from that way of thinking is that the Church and the Church's thinking should take from the lead of the culture, right? This advanced age, that through progress we are getting closer to perfection of humanity, and so that the Church should be in harmony and follow the leads of that age. And so again, this is an inversion, right? So the Church, certainly prior to this time, would and in many ways today, still today, would claim that no, in fact, that the Church should be leading and going out and Christifying the world. That the Church is not a servant of the dominant culture. And then the last point here, flexibility of doctrine should not be determined by individuals, right? So this idea of we shouldn't be quite so rigid in our in our doctrinal claims, and that who gets to make the claims of what doctrine is, it's on that individual level, private individuals, right? This is to the worry of Leo XIII and others, sort of smacks of Protestantism, right? Think back to our unit on Protestantism and Luther's claims, the rejection of priests for things like confession, right? I don't need to go to a priest to confess to him, for example, right? All I have to do is turn directly to God and ask God for forgiveness of my sins. So that sort of radical American individualism that we are always talking about in society today is of deep concern for Leo. Another problem that was going around at this time in the eyes of the popes was not just simply Americanism, but modernism, which was something that was floating around in the United States, but also in Europe, and in many ways until this day. So what is modernism, and what are the problems that the popes and others had with it? Let's turn to page 52, please. Page 52. Middle of 52 here. Modernist themes were drawn from various turn-of-the-century sources of religious speculation. Marvin R. O'Connell, in his balanced history of the movement, calls an anonymous document called Il Programma di Modernisti, probably the work of an Italian philosopher and editor named Ernesto Buonaiuti. My Italian's not very good. Perhaps the most succinct and coherent statement of the modernist position ever attempted. Among the principal elements of modernism identified there are, number one, immanentism, the idea that religion expresses a human need rather than convey divine revelation. Religion is the spontaneous result of irrepressible needs of man's spirit, which finds satisfaction in the inward and emotional experience of the presence of God within us. Let's pause there for a second. So immanentism, what does that mean? That religion expresses a human need rather than conveys divine revelation. So at this time, the turn of that century, you have a variety of things that have been arisen, right? Modern psychology, modern anthropology, modern sociology. Think of, for example, Freud. What does Freud say about religion? He was very anti-religious, and he would say, not just Freud, but Freud's a good example, things like, well, there is no God, that we're just sort of projecting our needs, of our struggles with our own parental fathers, and we're sort of projecting it out into sort of this and making up a God the Father, right? And so religion is not a sort of reception of divine revelation. It's not an engagement with something outside of ourselves, but it's a projection of our needs outside of ourselves so we can sort of deal with these psychological issues, according to Freud. So immanentism, the idea, again, turning on its head the idea of what religion is, right? Religion is not about conveying divine revelation. Let's keep reading. And number two, and evolution, said to provide the only basis for believing in permanence of something divine in the life of the church. Evolution here certainly being influenced by Darwin and biological evolution, but Darwin's theory did not sort of stay contained in the biological realm, but you see evolution, the sort of principle of evolution, find itself in all kinds of different other areas. Again, I was just mentioning sociology, anthropology. And so the idea here is when the idea of evolution is applied to a sort of doctrinal sense, that doctrine not only develops, as John Henry Newman in the 19th century would say in his essay on the development of doctrine, but that it evolves, right? And so this is something that Newman's text wrestled with deeply. How do we think about doctrine? As it's revealed by God, God doesn't change. So on the one hand, we should expect that it doesn't change, doctrine doesn't change. But when we look historically, we can see, well, it does develop, and he has a variety of principles of development. What does it mean to say development? But development in Newman's idea is not the same thing as change or evolution. In fact, he rejects that. He says the doctrine doesn't change, though it does develop. And we'll talk more about this in other classes like the dogmatic theology class. But that's not what others would claim, right? This idea of modernism is that that doctrines can over time not just develop, but change. And so you would have, as this modern advanced age progresses and we come to new insights that hadn't been known before, that doctrine needs to evolve as well. And evolution implies change. Think in the biological sense, right? That we aren't simply an outgrowth of other primates, But in fact, if you go back to that sort of primordial soup, that we come from single-celled organisms. And so to go from a single-celled organism to Homo sapien isn't simply a development, but it's a radical change. You're changing species, right? And it's that same principle is applied to doctrine. So this is a claim of modernism that is deeply problematic to popes around the turn of last century. Let's keep reading. This is on the top of page 53. On July 3rd, 1907, the Vatican's Holy Office, forerunner of today's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which actually recently had its name changed to the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, issued a decree named Lamentabili, listing and condemning 65 propositions found contrary to Catholic orthodoxy. 2 months later, on September 8th, Pope Pius X followed with an encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, feeding the Lord's flock, condemning propositions specifically linked to a heresy that he called modernism. Its philosophical basis was said to be situated in agnosticism, Pius X's term for the immanentist principle that religion's source is human need, not God. From this fundamental mistake, the Pope said, it follows that dogma, quote, not only can but ought to be evolved and changed. And then here's the third point: all religions are true, right? All religions are true. This is with modern anthropology, people going and studying, exploring other religions. With the increase of mass transit, planes, trains, and automobiles, going to other cultures in the Far East, for example, and learning about them and seeing not only that they have wisdom, but that the claim is at that time, and many will make the claim even till today, that all religions are true, right? Even when they contradict each other, right? Sometimes religions might have a different emphasis on certain positions, but oftentimes they contradict each other. And so even though there's contradiction among many religions, there's still this claim of many is the idea of all religions are true. This is the first example that comes to my mind in the second half of the 20th century, specifically coming out of the Holocaust, right? Think of when an understandable rejection of this problem of saying, well, when we say religions are different, not just different, but one are better than the other, what does that lead to? That leads to things like the Holocaust, right? And so in the second half of the 20th century, not just abstract philosophical claims about all religions are true, but coming out of that horror of the Holocaust, when we see some religions are said to be second or third class, you have a strong claim that all religions are true. One of the most popular books in the religious world in the second half of the 20th century was a book called by a man named Houston Smith, The World's Religions. This was a book that was taught in a lot of religion classes in the second half of the 20th century, and I think until today in some classes. Millions of these books were sold in the second half of the 20th century, which may not seem like a big deal, but religion books, other than like the Bible, generally don't sell millions and millions of copies. Religious scholars, Houston Smith was a scholar of religion. J.K. Rowling may sell millions and millions of Harry Potter books, but religion scholars don't sell millions of books, but Houston Smith did. And so you have, even until this day, a claim that all religions are true. So we just read that 65 claims were condemned, but here are sort of three of the most important claims of modernism: immanentism, evolution, and that all religions are true. The final thing I want to talk about in today's lecture, and this transitions us to next week when we get to the mid-20th century, to that third phase that lasts till now, and that is the answer is yes, we want to be fully American. Catholics want to be fully American. It's not simply in, for example, the political realm, but as we see here, so we're starting on page 99, this manifests itself in Catholic universities and the Catholic school system in general, which you'll remember we talked about this in the Maura Jane Farley book, at least at the K through 12 level, we talked about how and why the Catholic school systems broke off. Catholics started their own school systems in the 19th century because of those Bible riots that happened in places like Philadelphia, fighting over what Bible should be used in the public school system. Again, notice that the assumption was that a Bible should be used. It was just a question of which one. So what you have in the beginning into the early 20th century is Catholic universities. Catholic universities were seen as sort of second-class schools in the eyes, certainly of non-Catholics, but in the eyes of many Catholics themselves. You can think of, for example, the 1940s and 50s, Notre Dame was a very sort of popular school known for its football, and today it is known as a first-class educational institution. But at the time, it wasn't, right? It was only known for its football. And the reason was, in general, is that other universities, places like Harvard, those Ivy League institutions, looked at Catholic schools and said, okay, well, the point of a university is the pursuit of truth, and you have to go find truth wherever it is. And sometimes that's in unexpected places, and sometimes truth might contradict with what your assumptions are. You Catholic universities have sort of theological baggage, that you come from certain assumptions, assumed propositions, foundational claims about Jesus and the church and freedom, etc. And so you're not able to pursue truth where it inevitably must lead. And so because you have this sort of theological baggage, you can't be a real university. And so what is the Catholic response to that? Again, this is bottom of page 99. The failure of American Catholicism to render significant service to the intellectual life, Monsignor Ellis forcibly argued, was fully reflected in the failures of American Catholic colleges and universities. With relish, he quoted a 1937 address by Robert M. Hutchins, president of the University of Chicago, delivered at a regional meeting of the National Catholic Educational Association. The Catholic Church, Hutchins had said, possessed the longest intellectual tradition of any institution in the contemporary world. Yet, Catholic higher education in the U.S. had imitated the worst features of secular education, ignored most of the good ones. Ellis entirely agreed with that, while also adding his own specifically religious note to the indictment of Catholic schools: the absence of a sense of dedication to an intellectual apostolate, right? Added to what I was just saying, the idea of not a robust intellectual life. That buying into that Protestant critique we saw in the Farley book of Catholics just, listen to their Pope, listen to their bishops, listen to their priests, and they don't think for themselves. Let's keep reading. In conclusion, the historian held that the chief blame for the sorry state of affairs rested with Catholics themselves. It lies in their frequently self-imposed ghetto mentality, which prevents them from mingling as they should with their non-Catholic colleagues, and in their lack of industry and habits of work. It lies in their failure to have measured up to their responsibilities to the incomparable tradition of Catholic learning. Think back to that Nast cartoon that we saw in the Farley book of the sort of stupid, drunken Irish Catholic who has a dull mind. Clearly, Ellis has bought into that narrative, right? That Catholics in this sort of self-imposed ghetto mentality, they lack the industry and habits of work, right? So this Catholic intellectual Ellis is buying into that. But it wasn't just him. Shaw talks about when he was at Georgetown at that time in the sort of 50s, that professor that he had sort of got excited about Ellis's argument. And so from the mid 20th century until today, most Catholic schools have taken up Ellis's critique and got out of that quote-unquote ghetto mentality and have become really no different from secular institutions. Now, there has been some pushback on that. I don't want to say all Catholic institutions. Here we are in California. Think of Thomas Aquinas College here, just a few miles up the road. Started in the 1970s, right? Sometimes we think it's weird for universities to be started recently, that, places like Harvard have been around for hundreds of years. Why is it that a place like Thomas Aquinas College started? It was because Catholic schools started to become no different from their secular peers, and so places like Thomas Aquinas College wanted to have sort of strong Catholic identities and stick to what today we would call classical education. Because not only is Catholic identity steered away and gone towards those secular institutions, but the type of education, sort of an abandonment of what we would call a classical education. So there are some Catholic schools that either did not go down that route that most schools did, or were founded in order to push back against that, like Thomas Aquinas College. Let me just give one example to illustrate this, and then we'll wrap up this video and then finish up the unit next week. When I was filling out the paperwork, going through the proposals to get this MAPM program accredited, we have two accreditation agencies. Most schools only have one. There's a sort of secular regional accreditor. Ours is called WASC here in California, and I think also Hawaii. So every school who wants to be considered a university or college has an accreditation from a regional accreditor. Then we have a second one, which we don't have to have, and most schools don't have. It is an accreditor because we're a seminary, we're a sort of theological institution, right? We're not a university. This is not a specifically Catholic accreditor. It is a sort of Christian accreditor. And so while I was filling out the proposals for both of these, I was not consciously thinking about this initially, but I'm reading the questions of the proposals from these two accreditors, and I was sort of having to respond to them and answer them, and obviously a lot of them were and should be the same. What is your curriculum, for example? How are you going to run your online program? But it dawned on me at some point that the questions weren't that different from these two accreditors. In fact, much of what I was able to do was copy and paste answers from one proposal to the next. There were some differences. And what that made me realize is the questions that these accreditation agencies were asking, of course, is coming out of what are their concerns? What do they think is important in higher education, and that their questions are trying to determine how is this program going to fit or enact, live out these concerns, these core beliefs of what modern education should be. And so it sort of dawned on me that the questions from these two accreditation agencies weren't all that different, that what that was implying is that this Christian accreditation agency wasn't thinking that education was all that fundamentally different from this secular accreditation agency. So, if we believe in Jesus Christ, that should radically change our vision of the world in all things, and that includes education, right? Not just how we live our moral lives, for example, different from non-Christians, not how we treat our neighbors differently. Yes, love not only your neighbor, but love your enemy, right? So how we treat our neighbors and our enemies should be different from the way non-Christians think, but our educational systems should fundamentally be different. It shouldn't just be, education like secular institutions, and then maybe you'll throw in, a theology class or two as kind of a patina on top of your secular education. But this is sort of, again, a concrete example of how we see, starting in the mid-20th century until today, the embrace of the American cultural identity such that Catholic institutions become really no different. And so you have a lot of great academic institutions that are on par with schools, and in fact, in some ways better than those secular institutions that are often called elites. But as we're going to see, starting next week with the second half of the Shaw book, he's going to be asking, at what cost? Sure, schools aren't just known for their football programs now. They're known for their quality of education, but at what cost? That education is, again, often no different from the secular institutions. So that's what we will finish up with next week.